items to get us started. First is we do have a Q&A feature enabled. So as you have questions throughout today, feel free to drop them in that Q&A item on the bottom. We won't be answering questions in real time, but we're going to try to set aside some time at the end to respond to questions. Secondly, my colleague will drop her contact information, make it available to everyone as well in case you're having any tech issues during the webinar. And lastly, in order to invite you to be as present as possible today, we're going to be sharing slides. We also will be sharing a handout and we're recording the session. So if you have colleagues that are unable to attend, we will make that recording available to everyone here. We can move into introductions. So my name is Ali Corella. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Chicago. I'm a senior consultant at La Piana Consulting. I spent over a decade in the nonprofit sector. My current role gives me the opportunity to work with nonprofits across the nation, do a lot of work in strategy development, business planning, impact measurement, and I will hand it over to my colleague for a quick introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Umberto Camarena, he, him pronoun senior consultant at La Piana based in DC. And excited to delve into this topic, which, my world is in social innovation and how nonprofits can be more innovative in the way that we address issues. And that requires a lot of working groups and a lot of thought partnership, and making that effective in organizations is not always the easiest thing. So adding a little bit of context and structure to it is helpful. So hopefully these are some helpful tidbits of information.
And we developed the webinar today. Umberto and I were talking, and a lot of the organizations that we are working with kept uplifting questions and challenges to us related to their work groups and efficient time spent in those work groups, and the extent to which those work groups are actually achieving the goals that they were setting out to achieve. So, and this was coming up enough that we felt like it was an important topic to develop a webinar around. We can move to the next slide. By the end of this hour together, we will have explained the following. So our session objectives are, we'll get into like the types of issues that are best suited for which types of work groups. Of course, there's many different types of work groups. The best practices and effectively driving change together, and then some common mistakes to be aware of, and more importantly, to avoid when developing and engaging in work groups. So effective work groups, they really take a good amount of thought, and it's important to us that anything that we share today is easy for you to apply in your day-to-day work. We've broken up the session into 3 parts. What to think about before, during, and after work groups. We're going to give you tips, examples, we'll share best practices and resources, and leave you with a number of questions to consider. And if you're just joining us and you missed the first kind of intro there, we are recording today. We will make these slides available. We will also share a handout for any resources that we mention. So to start the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. So we're going to go ahead and launch a poll now, just to get a bit of a pulse of the group that we're working with. So spend a minute responding to these questions, and then we'll talk about them. So if you're just joining us, we have launched a poll. Please respond to our 3 questions. We'll give you about 30 more seconds, and then we'll talk about what we found here. Great. Let's go ahead and we can close the poll and share out the results. We had kind of responses across the board here. So almost everyone here is part of a work group. the largest response I'm seeing to whether or not those work groups are appropriate and productive is a neutral response. So maybe some portions of it are working, maybe some portions of it aren't working. Hopefully by the end of today's session, we'll have a clear idea of what it would look like to have more agreements to that question. And lastly, the outcomes of the work groups at my nonprofit are successfully communicated. Again, really similar responses. The bulk of people are in that neutral space and an exactly even split between disagree and agree. So I'll stop sharing that poll results now, or actually share the results in case you want to see it. Okay. And we'll end the poll and we'll keep moving with that in mind. So much of the success of your work group will be determined by the steps you take before you actually form the group itself. So I want to talk about activities to consider before forming a work group. And for the sake of today, I'm using this term work group, this kind of vague term, as an umbrella to describe any type of group where people are gathered together with a purpose to achieve some sort of goal in a collaborative way. I don't want to get too caught up in terminology in the session, but I have developed a resource for you all that we'll share out as a handout. We will make that available to you all in the email that we send out with the recording. And that handout walks through the different types of work groups, features, examples. Of course, different types of issues lend themselves to different types of work groups. So typically the issues that may surface that make you think about forming a work group are related to the following. So maybe it's related to a big question or a trend. An example of this could be the reproductive justice landscape is changing. How will this impact our work? Or perhaps it's an issue of innovation. How will AI impact the way we work? Operations. We need a more efficient case management system. Which tools should we use? And what will the associated change management require? Feedback. We have implemented a lot of changes to increase staff well-being. How are those being received, and is it even making a difference? Oversight. Are we actually advancing on our strategy and achieving programmatic goals? And lastly, governance. What is our investment policy? So not all issues need a work group. So we see feedback as an issue here. That's an example of something where you might be better served with a survey or a focus group or some sort of like ongoing participant or staff advisory board meetings rather than an actual work group. We'll kind of get into those characteristics in just a moment. Okay, so one consistent frustration with participating in work groups often has to do with feeling as though your input does not actually inform decision-making or ultimately change anything. So before you form a work group, take the time to think about what level of participation you're actually looking for. This image here is a resource that I often use when I'm talking about equity and transparent decision-making, but it's also really effective when forming a work group. So ask yourself if your group functions to inform, consult, involve, collaborate, or empower. An example of a work group aligned with inform might be your HR department providing informational sessions on the different coverage options in your benefits package. Here, the HR department may be providing details and examples of cost difference or options and more, but ultimately you're making the own decision based off of that information that you're receiving. Building off this HR example, let's look at this consult column now. So if it were a consult work group, it might just look like that feedback, those feedback groups I mentioned earlier. Say the HR department is developing a policy on parental leave. They might want to have some focus groups to gather information on what you all need in order for that policy to be effective. Again, participation here is solely to provide input. As we move to involve, this is where we see more of kind of like a baseline work group. So again, let's just build off of that HR example. Here you might gather a group of staff and with different types of expertise to help you think through those different coverage options. And staff are a bit more involved in the process. So maybe they're providing feedback, doing their own research, sharing back what they've learned with the group. Again, though, this work group may not have the authority to make decisions, but they're still sharing kind of different options to consider. For work groups that are collaborative, as we move kind of to the further to the right of this image, you'll take things a step further. You'll essentially say, okay, we've gathered the research, we've talked to the staff, we've thought about the pros and cons of each, we've even done a financial projection. We feel strongly that healthcare option 1 is the most equitable option for our organization. Still, though, this group doesn't make the decision. They're just clearly indicating what they think the best choice is based off of the work that they've done. Finally, work groups that seek to empower give full decision-making authority to members of the work group, regardless of the makeup of the team. So an empowered work group would choose the best benefits package for the organization. You'll hear terms like decision-making, role clarity, communication, and equity surface a lot in today's conversation. So keep that in mind. We're already hearing some of the ways in which communication, role clarity, and equity are already coming up. We can move to the next slide. So once you have confirmed, so first, what is the issue that you're grappling with? Is it worthy of a work group? If so, what type of work group are we looking for? Second, we need to be crystal clear about the type of participation that we're looking for. Once you have those two things covered, now you need to figure out if your work group is going to be time-bound or ongoing. So this slide just provides some examples of issues that would take place at the time-bound versus the ongoing spaces. So Umberto will get more into the details of this in a minute, but it's important that all work group participants need to know the timeline of the work group they are joining from the start. And I can move to the next slide here too. And these are just some more examples for you all. So remind yourselves that not all work groups need to be formal. Some are, but not all need to be. So have fun with your work groups. One organization that we worked with actually named their work group focused on organizational development, the OD Girlies. Think about how your work group can be both effective and achieve in its goal, but also be pleasant to be a part of. Before we talk about best practices to consider during the work group, I want to leave you with some of these questions to consider before you form a work group itself. There's a lot here, so I've broken it into two sections: identify and discuss. So for identification, think about who's actually able to convene a work group. Is this a top-down process, or can anyone come up with an idea? And if that idea gains some traction, get support to convene a group. Is the type of issue one that warrants a work group? If so, what type of work group would be best? Consider a time frame. So not just ongoing versus time-bound, but is there any date or event you actually need to work backwards from, or anything on the calendar that would stretch capacity for the work group participants that you need to take into account when scheduling? Next, do you have the expertise in-house to accomplish your goal, or do you need to involve external partners? If you need to involve external partners, the type of work group will likely be more of like an advisory board or a coalition of some sorts. And lastly, review that chart and confirm the level of participation that you're looking for in this work group, and be open and transparent in communicating that with the participants of your work group. We look at the second bottom of the slide here now around discuss. Clarify your enrollment. Is it invite only? Is it self-enrollment? Is it some combination of the two? How will the type of enrollment actually encourage buy-in? Determine both expertise and profiles of participants needed. So what content areas do they have a lot of experience with? And are you hearing diverse perspectives? Be crystal clear with the group about the level of decision-making authority that they will have. Review your commitment to equity. Ask yourself, how are you uplifting this commitment in forming a work group? So who's at the table? Who's not? Why? And it's more than just being given an opportunity to participate. It's about valuing those contributions equitably and setting group norms and being aware of the role of power. Next, think about who is the issue important for. Do you have agreement on the value add or the importance of the issue at hand? Does it resonate with everyone? Are they also invested in finding a solution? Have you identified a work group lead? If so, what are the expectations of this role? Has time been carved out for them to do this, or is it just added to their already likely full plate? And lastly, of course, if there's like a legal implication to consider, make sure you have work group participants with the right skill set and experience to situate you for success. So that's everything to think about before a work group. Now let's move into during. Umberto is going to walk us through that. Slide next.
Okay, thanks, Ali. So a lot of these things that you're going to be that you will have covered before the working group are still relevant during the working group. We want to make sure that there's kind of continuity in all the thought that was done prior to engaging a group and putting folks together. And that's going to inform really kind of the launch and how you dive into it. So there's going to be some overlap, for example, really identifying a chair or a project manager to keep the group on task and making sure that they have kind of clear role. If they're going to set the agenda, are they going to send out the meeting invites? Are they going to be responsible for keeping minutes or just keeping everybody on track? But really having a chair or project manager at least to be able to lead that effort. And depending on the complexity of the group and what you're looking at, you might also think about different roles that are needed. But a project manager is kind of a fundamental one role if you're going to have it. You might also think about having an executive sponsor for the group. So having folks that are higher up in the organizational kind of chart is really helpful to have represented here because they can really connect dots between the strategy of the organization, the direction that you're going, the resources that are allocated, and what's being discussed in the working group. And that presence really helps ensure kind of continuity of the conversation and allows for somebody to be able to champion what the group is discussing when it comes time to maybe asking for specific resources or communicating specific decisions. So another thing to really identify in terms of an effective working group is start and end dates. Is this something that's going to be continuing on forever? In which case, this is just going to be an ongoing community advisory board. It's going to be an ongoing board finance committee, or is this going to be kind of a task force that has a limited amount of time that is really helping us achieve a specific goal? In which case, when is the end date? I think is really helpful for people to keep in mind, both so that they know what limitations they're working with respect to making sure deliverables are set, and also so that they can balance out their own schedule. Clarifying the level of decision-making, that chart that Ali showed, I think is so helpful to really be crystal clear on what is the level of decision that this group is going to be holding. Are you responsible for making the decisions? Are you responsible for suggesting decisions? Are your decisions going to be taken and maybe only screened with a feasibility or financial lens? Or is it really just we are proposing ideas that we are brainstorming and passing it on to the leadership team, for example, to be able to do something with that information? This is a really important point because it's such a source of frustration for organizations or for working groups when there's kind of a discrepancy between what a group thinks they have the authority to do and what is actually given in terms of authority for them to make decisions. And clarifying that at the onset is just really helpful for everybody. Confirming and regularly recommitting to goals and objectives. This is what we're setting out to do as a group. And these are the key things that we want to hit along the way. Super important so that there's a North Star that everybody can get behind. We want to make sure that you're discussing roles and expectations for everybody in the group. As the group expands, what is everybody expected to bring? Are we just discussing? Are there things that people need to prep? What are different agreements? And this kind of goes into the norms of what agreements do we have for each other, either in allowing for flexibility or making sure that we have norms for sharing space. One of the prompts that I like to use is are we making sure that the space is both meaningful and it's pleasant? And that really gives us ideas for how we want to engage them. Maybe there's flexibility around the time that people can dedicate. Maybe there is a real kind of key focus that people are going to be coming in and out. So we have to have really clear charters and agreements and minutes and whatever that might mean. And so having clear expectations as to group norms helps people be able to perform and contribute kind of their expertise and their perspective to the task at hand. Ensuring diverse representation and inclusive practices. And there's an asterisk here because it's not something to check off. It's really something to live in different ways. And I think a discussion is something that is really well suited for this, where, you know, we're seeing, do people feel like their opinions are heard? Is there a space to really be able to share airtime, to feel like your considerations are being brought in? Are we being reflective? And I think that just that space to be reflective and intentional is really helpful. And there are a lot of things that you can do to ensure inclusive practices. Are you making sure that everybody's accessibility needs are being met at the onset of meetings? Are you taking that into consideration in how and when you convene groups? So those are some important things to be able to discuss and be intentional about. In terms of developing a charter can be really helpful. And we're going to look at the next slide in terms of what that could entail. But again, it just provides a lot of clarity for the group. I think a lot of just best practices in working groups is making sure that there is clarity of the work, clarity of expectations, clarity of how you contribute, and clarity of the progress that you've made. And so we really want to make sure that we're doing as much of this as is appropriate. There are some working groups that are going to be a lot more informal, and maybe a charter is just not appropriate because of the nature of it. But depending on the size of the organizations, depending on the complexity of the issue, these are some best practices that you might want to consider as helpful to what you're doing. You know, always ask yourself, how helpful is this to the progress of the group? Establishing a work plan with key milestones, and to this I will add also quick wins for the group, making sure that we are incorporating things that allow us to feel like we're really making progress and traction on the goals that we have established for this working group. Having a way to track the progress, whether that's a Gantt chart or whether that is kind of a work plan, something that you can say, we are really moving forward in, you know, how we expect this to impact our mission and the way that we go about our work. That can just be helpful to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And it's just kind of gratifying for everybody that's participating to see those things being able to be checked off and continue to work. This next piece is also a super important piece that I want to make sure that I emphasize, is holding retrospectives in the group and making sure that you're promoting accountability. And we're going to show another tool that's going to be helpful for this. When I'm talking about retrospectives, it's really an opportunity to pause and reflect on the work and take a look back. Whether it's an event that you've done, whether it's just an overall work that the committee is doing, it's really important to take a look back and have a debrief as to how is this going. And this is kind of another opportunity to ensure diverse representation, is to be intentional about the reflective spaces. We had a launch event yesterday. What went well? What could we improve? What should we keep in mind for the next time we have a similar event? What did we not account for? You know, different things that can allow us to look back and see how true were we to what we had set out. And again, we'll see a tool that I think is particularly helpful for this. And then also making sure that the group is reporting back and communicating. This is another really important area where I see groups struggle. Circling back to the leadership team, this is what we've been doing. These are maybe some sticking points that we had, or some progress that we made, or some questions that we're still wrestling with. Reporting back to the staff, reporting back to other stakeholders, letting people know what is happening, because oftentimes it can feel like either that working group isn't doing anything, or they're doing something. It's kind of this strategy group and it's behind closed doors and I don't actually know what they're doing. There can be a lot of assumptions made when we fail to communicate. And oftentimes it's not because of any kind of bad intention. It's just a lack of being purposeful about the communication. So be sure that you're closing loops, be sure that you're reporting back, even if it's an update to say, we met and did this, and you're still making progress towards your goal, even if there's not kind of a huge kind of finding to show for what you did, but helpful to just regularly communicate. When thinking about a committee charter, I made reference to this in the previous slide, we're really thinking about a living document that is able to keep this group in order. And if you have a committee or a working group or a task force, whatever it might be, that has a rotation of folks and new people are coming on, either because the committee is expanding or because there's a rotation of people and you're getting kind of fresh energy and people are cycling out, or for whatever reason it might be. Maybe somebody just wants information and is considering joining. A committee charter is a living document that really gives people a strong overview of what your group is doing, why you're convening, and what they can expect to see from it. And it's a really helpful document for people to plug in. Again, depends on the level of formality. Maybe this feels like it's something that's too formal for your working group, and it doesn't really jive. But oftentimes we find that it is really helpful for clarifying. And even if it's something that you decide to not kind of formally construct, when you are launching your working group, these are really important considerations to clarify, because even if they're not explicit, they should definitely be understood by everybody that's participating in the working group. So these areas are objectives and key outcomes. Why is this group convened? What do we expect to see? What will be different in our organization, in our mission, when this group kind of effectively hits their goals? Roles and responsibilities, who's going to be doing what? Authority and scope, this is going back to the decision-making. This is the authority that this group has. This is the reach that authority has in terms of its implications on the organization. Budget and resources, what kind of funding do we have to play around with and to be able to do the work that we need to do? And maybe that's something that needs to be kind of developed and approved later, but really keep in mind what that means. And not just for events, if you're going to be launching an event or developing communications material, but also considering the time of the people that are going to be participating in the working group. Term limits, if it's relevant, if this is going to be an ongoing group, is it going to be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, no term limits? Think about what that means for people being able to be kind of approaching this with a fresh perspective. Think about what it means in terms of, if a term limit is too quick, that transfer of knowledge to the next person might be a really difficult handoff. Think about what that means in terms of being able to share space and time, being able to bring in new perspectives. So term limits, something to discuss, and generally a helpful thing if it's going to be an ongoing group. Timeframes for when decisions need to be made or when you need to hit some key things. Maybe you are working towards a very specific deliverable that the funder is requiring. Maybe you are working with a very specific timeline that actually has to do with the election cycle. Being clear with key timeframes that your group needs to incorporate into the way that you work is really helpful for knowing how to prioritize things and how people are expected to show up in the space. It could be that between now and the end of the year, this working group is going to have a lot of important meetings to be able to address, and that after the new year, the timeline is able to expand and be a little bit more flexible. But being clear about that and having those conversations up front is really helpful. And then when we're talking about norms, how do we want to show up in the space? How do we want to show up with respect to the way we report out to different stakeholders? With what frequency? How are we going to be communicating? It's going to be an email to leadership, an email to staff. Is it going to be a presentation? Is it going to be a Teams message just to give people an FYI? Are we going to have to vote on certain things? If so, are we expecting kind of a simple majority? Does everybody have to agree? Does just the project manager have to agree? Or is this the project sponsor maybe? Do we need some kind of quorum where X amount of people need to be present for certain decisions? And then thinking about confidentiality and what kinds of things that the work group discusses stay in the work group versus what kinds of things can be shared. And again, here, it all depends on the nature of the working group and the culture of the organization, but really be intentional about having these discussions because they can be very fruitful, and kind of that saying that a stitch in time saves nine, that if you do this work ahead of time, you're really going to be avoiding a lot of mishaps and miscommunications and any other issues that could arise. Right, so you're not going to be able to field all of them, but a significant amount. And then lastly, success indicators. What will it look like for this committee to be successful? What will it mean? How will we be able to observe it? Not everything can be observable and evaluated in concrete ways, but the more specific and concrete we can try to think about it, the better of an indication we will have of when this group will have concluded and successfully achieved what it was setting out to do. A few other ideas on how to foster kind of an effective work group, particularly from a leadership perspective. If you are the project manager, the executive sponsor, even if you don't hold a particular leadership in the group, but I think there's a lot to be said about informal authority. And I think actually on that point, a good thing to mention in terms of diverse representation, it's helpful to have diverse representation in all sense of the word in terms of the working group. And a type of diverse consideration that is often overlooked is how are we looking at diversity in terms of organizational hierarchy, and making sure that there is presence from different folks within the organization that are able to see it in different ways. And so they're able to contribute different perspectives to what we're doing. And I really like to invite folks with informal authority into working groups because I think that even if they don't have a director level position, even if they're not an executive level, they may not be the CEO of the nonprofit, but there's a lot of folks with strong informal leadership in the organization and informal authority that when they speak, when they share something, people really listen. And I think that's a really important contribution to consider, in addition to gender diversity, age diversity, and all the the other types of diversity that are really important for making sure that we're being equitable and open and informed by a lot of different perspectives. So that's also kind of part of this first point of inclusive leadership, is who are we inviting into the room, reflecting on who is not in the room, and how do we make sure that we're bringing out the best in everybody who is present. Having really clear communication, how are we communicating, when are we communicating? Ideally, you have a communications plan for the group, or even just a reminder. We're picking this up at the beginning of the month. It's kind of time to communicate with folks. What things have you done in the last month that should be communicated? Who should be hearing about them? How are we going to do it? As simple as that. And again, it could be a Teams notification. It can be a message on Slack. It doesn't have to be something super formal. But what does the moment require of us? Training and development. A lot of working groups are spaces for people to kind of gain professional development opportunities. So how are we making sure that the people that are in this group have the resources and training that they need to be effective in it? Recognition, celebration. There's a lot of time and energy that goes into working groups that often goes overlooked because sometimes it's in addition to the work that you're already doing. So really being intentional about celebrating success authentically, recognizing people's contribution, and the more specific that we can be, the better that will be. So it's not just, hey, great job leading that meeting, but Ali, I really appreciated the way that you summarized the meetings with really clear action points. I walked away with that super clear as to what I needed to do. And it was just really helpful because I have a million other things going on. Really recognizing people's contribution is just always an effective thing, whether it's in the working group or outside. And then learning culture. This kind of goes back to the point of retrospectives and being able to look back and say, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? Let's be honest about it and really taking it as an opportunity to do better. And so what can we take from this to improve the way that we work? This next slide might be a little bit hard to see, and that's okay. It's going to be in your handout, and the points that are in this web are all listed on the left. So if you're not able to read it, it's okay. It'll become clear as I explain it. But this is a radar chart or a spider diagram that we developed to really be able to help you assess how healthy your working group is. And I think that a lot of the issues that we're going to be looking at when we talk about common mistakes and a lot of the things that we've already covered can really be addressed if you utilize this periodically. And so what this is, it's a chart that has these different elements of what makes a working group strong. Effective communication, accountability towards goals, decision-making clarity, adequate resources, active participation, effective work planning, morale, work balance, diversity, effective meeting structure, group cohesion, and the presence of relevant expertise. Again, you don't have to jot all these down. We'll send them to you in the PowerPoint, and you'll receive this tool afterwards as well. But the point here that I want to make is that when we look at all of these things holistically, we're able to appreciate how strong are we as a group, where are we doing really well, and also where are we doing not so well. And importantly, what do we do about it? So the way that I would recommend approaching this, and it can be done one of two ways or more probably, is asking everybody to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how they feel about these different items. And taking all of those and averaging. Well, effective communication, let's say an average of 3.5, and then we'll plot it on this diagram. Accountability towards goals, it averaged a 5, so we're going to plot it on that diagram. Take the averages of the group and put them on, and then you'll be able to look at it as a whole, and we'll look at an example. Another way of being able to do this is having everybody plot their answers, and also this is, I think, more effective in terms of inclusion, seeing how much disparity there is between responses. If somebody says that work balance is a 1 and another person says a work balance is a 4, really being able to see, there's kind of a huge range here to consider for some of these answers. What do we make of this? How is it that some people can feel like there's really strong group cohesion while other people really don't feel that way? Here, I think another really important thing to consider is how safe people feel being able to express this, and the level of honesty that may or may not be able to be expressed in the space. So you really want to exercise strong judgment when implementing this to see how safe people feel. And that's why kind of an average approach of aggregate responses might be the best approach. So here we see an example of one that's filled out. And what we would like to see is a round diagram that is large. And this is kind of a really helpful visual way of saying, when we're looking at communications, it looks like there's really strong communication. It looks like the meeting structure is really working well. It looks like there is strong work balance. The decision-making is clear, that we have the resources that we need. That's all going really well. And then there are some areas, for example, we see a 2 in group cohesion. We see a 3 in active participation. We see a 3 in morale. And this is a group that we might look at and say, you're really strong at working towards your goal as a working group. It might be the way that you go about it and the dynamic that might be less enjoyable. And so this would be really helpful to kind of put forth to the group and kind of ask, all right, what do we make of this? What are the things that we are doing that are limiting people's ability to actively participate or that are hindering morale, and really being able to put this on the table for the group to discuss. I think a lot of the issues that working groups that working group has experienced is that there's no way of really being able to assess this because the time isn't being carved out for it. The questions aren't being asked, or there's really no space to be able to safely discuss these. If this chart were the opposite, and there's really strong group cohesion, there's great group morale, we're really far from the goals, that's a really different conversation to have. And it's important to be able to identify those things. That's where I feel this tool is so useful, because it's an excuse to be able to have a conversation and to be able to act on things a little bit more from an evidence-based perspective than from a gut. I could be like, Ellie didn't really participate in the last meeting, and she's been kind of quiet recently. I think she must be really frustrated with the way that things are going. Could be that Allie just has a lot of things going on, and maybe there is construction happening near her. Maybe she needs to pick up her kids from school. It could be a million different reasons that have nothing to do with the working group. So unless we are purposeful about asking and assessing and then discussing, we're going to make a lot of assumptions. And so I just want to really make a plug for using this periodically to be able to assess the health. And periodically might mean once every 3 months. It might mean 2 months after the onset of the group. It might mean every year, depending on how relevant it is for your group. But definitely try to incorporate this into the way you work, because it could really shed a lot of insight for the way that you operate. This next slide, I'm going to kind of try to breeze through, because a lot of this are things that I think can actually really be addressed through that radar or spider chart that we just looked at. But these are frequent things that we hear from organizations. They're talking about things behind closed doors and they don't want to share what's happening. How long will we be meeting for? This kind of seems like it's going on forever. There's too many cooks in the kitchen. I try to get a word in and it's just like impossible. People are dominating the space. Or I have too much work. I can't feasibly participate in this because it's just another thing on an already full plate. And so on the right, there are different kind of potential solutions, and there's no silver bullet. There's no just one thing that you can do. This is just a brainstorm of ideas to really help you begin to make traction. Having a communications plan to really be able to report out to folks, like I shared before, is really helpful so that people don't feel like you're meeting behind closed doors. Setting really clear time limits and expectation, having that in a charter or having that be kind of a supplemental material, having a work plan will be really clear for folks. If people feel like they can't get a word in, or why am I even here because there's so many other people with expertise, well, do we have the people that we need? Being able to assess that, going back to that radar chart and assessing, do people feel like they can speak in the space? Maybe the issue is we actually need to build in more time for this, because there's so much to say that people are talking over each other and we could just go on for a lot longer. Maybe if people are dominating the space. So again, a more accurate assessment of what's happening can then help you take action in a more appropriate way. And when people feel like there's just too much happening and they have so much on their plate, it's really important to connect with folks outside of the working group, connecting with their supervisor, letting them be clear about the expectations, letting them know what's being expected of them, what these time frames are like. If you are leading up to a specific event, what is that going to mean in terms of time, in terms of energy, but allowing them to be able to share that with their supervisor, ideally be able to balance off their putting this on their plate, what are they taking off? Even if it's temporary, but or just having a conversation as a group, how can I help you with these certain things? But this is another pretty frequent thing that we hear. The worst that you can do is ignore it and just kind of assume that the person is going to be able to keep up with the pace of what's being asked. Some other challenges: this group is a waste of time. We're not even doing anything. The group is toxic. I really used to enjoy participating before, but now I really feel like it's a drag. And again, really assessing with that radar chart how people are feeling, making sure that there is progress, that we have clear objectives, that we are incorporating quick wins into what we're doing. There are AI tools now that can really tell you who is sharing, who is speaking, how often it's shared, is somebody dominating space, and that can be a really helpful way of analyzing your tools. Ensuring different ways of getting feedback is really important if you're not sure their psychological safety. So offering spaces for people to anonymously share their feedback, or having one-on-one space with people can be really helpful. And then kind of assessing, are people overscheduled? Is there an overwhelming bureaucracy in the way that you work? Is it really poor communication? What is it that's weighing people down in a group, and trying to address that? And again, that goes to kind of a culture of learning. How are we really being attentive to what people are sharing and trying to address it is just something that is super helpful. So keep that in mind. And again, the more intentional you can be about these conversations, the better off your group will be. And if your group needs to terminate, that is a very real thing too. Sometimes it's just you're not making the progress that you wanted towards your goal, or you didn't make the progress and it's just time to finish, or whatever that can look like. Also be open to different configurations of how you work and what the group looks like, but in dialogue with each other. The last piece of this is looking at how we engage with working groups after the fact. And so some working groups are going to be ongoing, and this is still really important to keep in mind. So once your working group is finalizing or has finalized, providing feedback and retrospectives, we've already talked about this, but feedback. Thank you so much for your contribution. This is what it meant to me. This is what we learned. These are some growth opportunities. Closing the feedback loops and communicate. This is what the working group accomplished. Acknowledging people's contribution individually, to the leadership, to the staff, to our stakeholders, whatever that looked like for you, but making sure that we're communicating. If we're seeking feedback from the outside, closing the loop, I think that's something that I can never emphasize enough. If we get information, this is what we heard, this is what we're doing with the information, this is the impact of it. Recognizing efforts, celebrating success. And this last point is something that we haven't talked about yet and is really important, is ensuring that there's follow through. There's nothing that's more disheartening in working groups that when the working group finishes, the work just stops. And so you want to make sure that there's a plan for continuity. How are we making sure that this work that we did is going to be sustainable, it's going to continue, that the seeds that we planted are actually going to kind of take root, and that there is kind of a handoff or a follow-up or whatever that might mean for your group and how you're configured. But definitely think about the objectives and what happens afterwards, so that that work continues. As a recap to everything that we've discussed, there are kind of some things to do before, during, and after a working group to really ensure success. When we're thinking about before, what type of working group do we want to create, making sure that there is alignment between the questions that we're asking and the group that we're convening. Is it ongoing? Is it temporary? What is their level of participation and decision-making that they will have in this process, and really being clear with what is needed and how that will be shared with the group, and doing all the pre-work that is needed to set them up. During, it could really be distilled to these 2 bullet points, which is making sure that the structure and roles and expectations for the group is really clear, and that we're regularly assessing the health of the organization. I'm sorry, not the organization, of the working group. And then when we're looking at after, we're reflecting on what happened, we're closing feedback loops, we're celebrating success, and we're ensuring that there's continuity to the work and that it's going to have a life beyond the lifetime of that working group. And then just some closing reflections for you all to think about as you think about those working groups that you're involved in. Where do you feel that your working group needs the most support? Is the way that you're tracking progress and wins effective for your working group? How are power dynamics playing out in your group? And how does that impact people's participation and the overall work that you are expected to do? So those are some things for you all to kind of take after this session and really wrestle with and kind of reflect, and that can help you take some next steps within your working group. So I know that we are kind of approaching the end. We have 10 minutes for a bit of Q&A, and I see that there's already some questions that are coming in. Ellie, anything to add before we open it up?
I'm just looking at both of the questions that have come in are related to kind of external groups. So if it's okay, I was going to go ahead and start with those questions. So 2 questions came in about, okay, so this is all we focus mostly today on internal work groups, right? So what does it look like? What do you need to think about before, during, and after creating these groups within your organization for them to be effective and for people to be able to contribute in an equitable way? But a lot of the things that we're talking about do apply to engaging external partners or community members in thought groups, work groups, conversations as well. Typically, those conversations they may take the form of like a participant advisory board, or maybe a coalition if you're an advocacy organization, or maybe it's just a kind of a strategic partnership where you're referring participants from one organization to another, or maybe it's even like a community panel, like a town hall kind of thing, where you're inviting community members to share kind of their insight and their needs, so your organization can think about tackling them. The most obvious ways that what we talked about today connect to that external facing group, I think, is around like first transparency and honesty. So what are you committing to? So you're seeking input to what end? So you're seeking input because whatever you hear, you're going to be able to solve for, or you're seeking input on a specific thing that you have the resources and the capacity to really tackle head on. So setting some kind of really clear boundaries and being very transparent with, given the information that you learn in that setting, what are you committing to being able to do with that information? Umberto mentioned this, like closing the feedback loop. So after you invite participation from your community members, and you gather that input, what does closing the look like in terms of reaching back out to them and saying, for those of you that attended this conversation, here are some of the biggest themes that came up. Here's what we're doing about it, and here's what we've committed to, right? So it's not just this kind of one-sided input pull for you all to then make decisions behind closed doors. And the last thought I had on this, and this is just kind of like a real-time response, is setting some collaborator criteria. So if it is a bit of a more formal partnership or coalition or something, much like you would create a strategy screen to develop criteria to make strategic decisions, you can develop a collaborator criteria screen of what are the roles of each of the organization in the partnership, who's leading, who's setting the agenda, what does decision making look like? So any of those things that we applied to kind of these internal work groups, they also can apply to engaging external partners. The very last thought I have is around more like leadership advisory spaces. So maybe like an ED or a president engages regularly with an advisory board, members from diverse organizations, and maybe even some for-profit spaces to give strategic advice. That can be done a little bit on a more of a one-on-one level as well. But certainly many of the things that we talked about in today can be applied to that external facing group as well. Umberto, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add to that response.
The only thing I'll add is that there are some really important considerations for inclusion. So the times that you're meeting, is this going to be something that is feasible for the folks that you're inviting in, especially if they're going to be community members, kind of really thinking about their schedule in terms of work, in terms of childcare, will you be providing childcare, thinking about compensation for that external folks to participate, and will they be compensated, how will they be compensated, and making sure that those things are clear. I think that yeah, those are just some really good things to also consider in that. So we're almost at time. So what I'd like to do is just launch the closing poll for the session and just invite folks to please reach out to us via email with any follow-up or questions. We will be sending, as we've said, the recording and some handouts to go along with this. But yeah, we'll be super kind of curious to hear what things resonated with folks, what seems like they could use some more resources so that we can be kind of as responsive as possible to what folks are needing. And with that, we'll just say thanks for attending, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks for filling out that poll on your way out the door. It was great to see you all.